The Righteous Fire Inpulsa Bomber was a massive success. Over the course of 4-ish days, we were able to speedrun all the content and kill every endgame boss on a 5-link. These kills weren't the prettiest, but on a 5-link and the first weekend of the league level of gear, I'm pretty happy with the results. As a quick recap to the build concept, we are taking a build that scales Righteous Fire damage and shoving explosions into it, to make the clear go from a 5 to a solid 10. We're accomplishing this through an Inpulsas Chest Piece, which makes shocked enemies explode. We make the enemy shocked via Storm's Gift, and subsequently we then ignite those enemies with the Inpulsa's explosion via Stormfire, which allows the lightning explosions to ignite, which we can then proliferate with Fan the Flames, key notable from a medium cluster jewel. This same RF bomber concept can be done to a higher extent if you can acquire a Crusader explosion chest, but those chests don't exist on day 2, and certainly aren't cheap later on in the league. The prior uniques I mentioned, however, are dropped by day 2, and later on in the league, when explode chests exist, those uniques will be very budget in comparison. So this build brings satisfying explosions and successful boss kills to a beautiful matrimony. Now, breaking down the build in this video, everything you're seeing has been done as a Trickster, but I would highly suggest this build be ran as a Chieftain. I solely ran it as a Trickster so that I could get a good feel how life-based Tricksters performed vs a Chieftain, and so I could respec this character into an ES Righteous Fire Trickster later on after the fact. From playtesting it, Trickster feels great for clear speed, but falls short in survivability, sustain, and often has less single target once you lose your power and frenzy charges, which is most boss fights. I will be including a path of building in the description for both, but once again I recommend the Chieftain variant. This build was able to run all boss fights, so in order to find its limits, one looks at delirium content. From testing T16 maps, I found 60% delirium to be comfortable, while going up to 80% would add an air of rippiness to it, while still being doable, and finally getting to 100% delirium maps where it really became a lot less doable. Now, this is considering the fact I was using fairly scuffed gear, which gives me hope that with some higher end gearing, one could expect to conquer 100% delirium maps. After all, 100% maps are currently the hardest content in the game besides deep delves, and one shouldn't expect to complete this content easily unless decently min-max, which I was not. It should also be noted that chaining explosions tended to fall off the higher the delirium one would go, because delirium increases damage reduction, which directly scales down our ability to chain explode. We would still chain ignite through packs, but the satisfying pops would start to fall off in 80% delirium maps, and really once you got to 100% delirium maps, it would just be the chain ignites that would still kill a lot of packs, but it would be a much slower chain. Now, speaking of gearing, I have both this character, which I assembled in 4 days off of a league start, and I have my Righteous Fire Bomber, which I perfected in Harvest League. Looking at both these characters' gear sets should give you a clear idea of what mid-tier investment gear looks like, all the way up through what super high-end gear set would look like. I will also be including alternate early leveling gear suggestions to give you an idea of nice gear pieces to start with when leveling through the campaign into early maps. For the purpose of time, I will only be verbally addressing my Inpulsa Bomber gear, but feel free to pause the video throughout to analyze the leveling or high-end gear variations which interest you. To kick things off, we have the one-hand scepter. Ideally, stats on this item are going to be % fire damage, % fire dot multi, plus to fire spells or plus to all spells, and % burning damage. This item can also be a wand, but wands are less optimal as their implicits only scale flamewall damage and not RF or the Inpulsa explosions. Moving on to our shield slot, we used Rise of the Phoenix. This is a cheap option that feels good for sustain, but can ultimately be greatly outclassed by the high-end rares, or even Asaphals if you can get good flat life on gear. I was struggling to get flat life on a lot of my gear, so I opted to keep Rise of the Phoenix temporarily. Now, I didn't do this because I prefer the shield charge playstyle, but if you wanted to go for a higher single target route with dash or flame dash movements, you can opt for Searing Touch, a very powerful and cheap unique for RF and flame wall damage. Moving on to our rings, mandatory of course is Stormfire. It ignites enemies with lightning damage, and then simply a ring for fixing resistances, and life is great for the build. Looking at our Amulet, Replica Edziri's Foible makes our life sustain feel much better and is a great option to consider if you want much better life regen. However, a rare Amulet with life and resistances will work as well until you can afford Edziri's Foible. For our last piece of jewelry, the belt, we really want a belt with life and resistances and life recovery rate. If we can get lucky enough, an Elder Leather belt, at least item level 75, is a great item to throw pristine fossils at to craft. But before you start throwing pristine fossils at it, I would recommend buying 4 fertile catalysts best to quality it while it is a normal item before crafting it. This will increase your odds to hit life affixes as well as multiply their value by 20%. Next up, we have our boots. I opted for Calm's Roots because I am a Trickster and I had no easy access to stun immunity, and it was just frankly annoying to die to stuns. But for Chieftain, this is easily accounted for by spending 2 passive points to pick up Unwavering Stance. I would then recommend going for a 2-tone pair of boots for resistances as well as life and movement speed. Now after the boots we come to our gloves, which we need to use Storm's Gift as they are mandatory for Inpulsa's explosions to occur. These gloves can have many different implicits, so I'd recommend shopping around for good implicits that suit you. I simply bought the first pair that existed, so I only had one choice, which was one with cold res on it. Moving on to our chest piece, the item our clear speed is built around, of course, is Inpulsas. This can eventually be upgraded to an explode chest on a very high end of the build, but should carry you through all the content until you can afford such an upgrade. And last but certainly not least, for our helmet, as is the case with almost all Righteous Fire builds that are life-based, I highly recommend an Essence of Horror Elder Helmet craft. Ideally, this is an easy way to get an additional 6-link setup, but on the high end can become even a powerful 7-link. Keep in mind this craft is very RNG gated, and I would not recommend attempting to craft a multi-link helmet until you have decent gear in most of your other gear slots. Also, during the crafting process, if you hit additional link supports that make it a viable helmet for other builds, generally it is worth considering selling the helmet you created to another person that can make use of it, so that way you can make back some of the losses you spent crafting. For this craft, you ideally want to use an item level 82 Elder Helmet. If you can manage, get a helmet that doesn't have int as a base, because that adds mana into the pool, which makes you less likely to hit conk effect. Hopefully this gives a good idea of gearing options. Now let's break down the passive tree elements, starting with the cluster jewels. I recommend 2 large and 4 mediums. For the large jewels, I would recommend grabbing a large fire damage cluster in between the item level of 50 and 67, and then rolling them with scorched fossils. This should fairly often give you Burning Bright, with at least one other notable, which will put Burning Bright on the travel passive to a jewel socket, with the next upgrade being going for a 3 notable jewel with Burning Bright, thus giving you an additional notable. Now remember, you want these to be 8 passive jewels, not 9 or 10 or anything higher than 8, and the most ideal jewel would have Widespread Destruction and Burning Bright both on the travel passives, thus giving you a lot of AoE and damage for the build, helping the ignites and the explosions chain much better. Moving on to the medium clusters, we at least need 1 Fan of the Flames for the optimal Ignite Explosion Proliferation, followed by Burning Bright on every cluster setup possible. After Burning Bright, additional notables I would recommend are Flow of Life, Brush with Death, and Cooked Alive, as ideal secondary notables going along with a Burning Bright as your first notable. These ideal clusters aren't usually going to be easy to create, so initially you will want to settle for just Burning Bright, or Burning Bright with a non-ideal passive like Student of Decay, for example, until you can afford to craft better outcome. Additionally, when it comes to cluster jewels, I've seen people skip out on allocating the jewel sockets for 1 passive point investment. This is a huge mistake. 1 passive point for a jewel socket is always worth it. At the very least, grab a jewel with % life and burning damage, or fire damage, or % life and resistances, or even % fire and % burning damage. A 2-stat jewel like this can easily be acquired for 1 to 5C and is always better than almost any other passive point allocation you will make on the tree, generally speaking. After the cluster jewels, the passive tree for Trickster and Chieftain mirror each other a bit. Both trees go to the Elemental Overload and Elemental Equilibrium branch of the passive tree, and with that, large cluster and fire notables, but the trees reflect each other, grabbing life and clusters on opposite sides of that center point. The Trickster obviously going in between Witch and Shadow area, and the Marauder going in between the Marauder and Templar area. Now I am including a path of building for both, and each path of building will come with leveling trees, which can be selected at the bottom in the path of building, so you can have an idea of which passives to grab when. I currently am using the community path of building fork, which I highly recommend downloading, otherwise you will get an error when trying to load in or import these path of building trees. Now let's get a look at the gem link setup. For auras, we use Malevolence, we use Herald of Ash, just because Herald of Ash makes explosions prettier. I don't honestly know if this makes the explosion chains more effective or not. I just like the look of being able to customize my explosions. You may not actually need to use Herald of Ash and could potentially swap this out for something that is a better aura for damage or for survivability, but I like the pretty explosions, so I go with it. And then Vitality. Ideally, if you are a Chieftain, you might not have as much mana to reserve this, and you don't have the Eldritch Battery to be able to use for mana sustain, in which case you might need to de-level your Vitality or grab a 4% or 8% reduced mana reservation on the tree, or even go for an Enlightened support setup, because you will have extra links once you get rid of Calm's Roots. After auras for movement, we go with Second Wind Flame Dash, as well as faster attacks, shield charge, Fortify. This is just so you can keep up Fortify for damage reduction in maps, and then Flame Dash to go over objects whenever you want. It's usually a pretty quick responsive movement skill. After that, we use Scorching Ray on bosses. Whenever we get to them, you can use that to apply a minus 25 fire res from fire exposure. After the minus 25 from Scorching Ray, we have Orb of Storms with combustion support. What this does is this ignites the boss, thus subtracting 19 fire res due to combustion, as well as inflicting lightning damage on the boss, which makes them take minus 50 res due to elemental equilibrium. This is where you want to look at this node when you have it selected and verify, yes, it does not do fire damage. If you have fire damage anywhere on your gear for spells, it'll show up here. So always a good way to check is just to hover over your Orb of Storms, make sure it doesn't have fire anywhere, and you're good to go. You're not dealing fire damage with your spells, and you're not breaking your damage completely. After that, we have our damage setups, which are Righteous Fire and Flamewall. We have Righteous Fire in this 5-link in our Inpulsas because we rolled burning damage support on our helmet. So for our 5-link Righteous Fire, we went for efficacy, burning damage, elemental focus, and concentrated effect. You can also swap in a 6-link of inspiration support, but you would have to generate inspiration charges somewhere else. Now for Flame Wall, we have Flame Wall with control destructions, efficacy, and elemental focus. Now this is important to keep in mind. If we had rolled the Essence of Horror mod with Conk Effect here, we'd want the Righteous Fire in the helmet setup because Conk Effect does not apply to Flame Wall's secondary debuff, which means it doesn't really do that much for Flame Wall as a damage support. So ideally, if you're doing a 6-link helmet, make sure if it's Conk Effect, you're using Righteous Fire in the 6-link. If it's burning damage, I recommend Flame Wall because Flame Wall itself is easier to keep up on boss fights because you often have to run around and dodge while you can just put Flame Wall on top of a boss and keep dodging around. So often I like to have Flame Wall in the better 6-link damage support if I have that option available. Now moving on from gem links, we have our flasks. Now everybody always makes fun of me for this until eventually I'm going to convince the entire population to use small life flasks with Righteous Fire builds, and the reason for this is it consumes 5 of 21 charges if you have reduced charges rolled on it, and I am simply using it to turn off Righteous Fire. Now the reason a small life flask is important is because of that 5 charges. This ties into our Pantheon. Our Pantheon is Ryslotha. Pantheon says life flask gains 3 charges every 3 seconds if you haven't used a life flask recently. So in a boss fight scenario, if I have turned my Righteous Fire on and off a lot of times and I've used up my entire life flask, if I get to a scenario where I really want to turn off Righteous Fire, I don't want to have to wait 15 seconds to get 15 charges if I'm using something like an Eternal Life Flask. I would much rather have this small life flask, which can generate the charges needed to turn off Righteous Fire with only 2 ticks of Ryslotha. That's the reason for that, because turning off Righteous Fire often heals you more than grabbing a higher HP life flask would. So it's more ideal for me to be able to turn off Righteous Fire whenever I need than to have an extra little 1k or 2k life regen from a life flask. Additionally, if we turn off a Righteous Fire, we activate the captured Queen of the Great Tangle, which gives us some recovery rate if we stop taking damage over time recently. So turning off Righteous Fire means we stop taking damage over time recently, and thus activating Great Entangle, which makes us get some more sustain. Now moving on from our small life flask, we have the Eternal Mana Flask with Remove Bleed. I like Remove Bleed on the Mana Flask because this one has the most charges, we have to use it the least, and thus we can usually proc it whenever we're about to take damage from a bleed or something like that. So keeping that in mind, I tried this a little bit with the Trickster. I didn't like it a ton. I liked Eldritch Battery more for sustain, but possibly for the Chieftain this might be the play, is to use Agnostic mixed in with this Eternal Life or Mana Flask, and then maybe that could provide some additional sustain, because if your Mana Flask is filling up your mana faster than it is taking mana to give to your life pool, you can also sustain life with the Eternal Mana Flask, which basically to acquire some additional regen for yourself. So consider that as a possibility. Maybe try it out, see if you like it or not. I tried it out on Trickster. I didn't like it enough because I couldn't manage it very well, although it did give some additional sustain, which was nice. Moving on, we have Quartz Flask. I've decided I'm pretty much addicted to Quartz Flasks now. I'm not sure I can play builds without Quartz Flasks because phasing just feels so good just to run through people. And then on it, we have Reduced Charges and Remove Curses. Basically makes curse maps not feel bad because you can just pretty much always have this uptime. Feels great. Next, we have Witchfire Brew, which applies Despair to enemies and gives us some additional increased damage over time. It's great for an additional curse on a boss. If you find you're running out of charges and can't keep this up during a boss fight, with the additional links, I would recommend doing a curse on hit flammability or curse on hit despair setup with your Orb of Storms with some of those extra links you'll have from using two-tones. After Witchfire Brew, Quicksilver Flask, I can't really play builds without it. It's just so mandatory. The extra 70% movement speed is key for feeling good while mapping. Now hopefully that gives you a good perspective on the gear to go for, the passives to go for, the support gems to use and whatnot. I hope you have a good time playing this build. I'd highly recommend it as a Chieftain. The only drawbacks I had to this build was because I didn't have great fizz reduction and because my sustain was a little bit worse. And frankly, Chieftain fixes all those problems and brings in a little bit better single target. When I put it into Path of Building, it was more consistent single target. So I think I can highly recommend this build. And often I think there's a lot of optimizing you can do to improve it even beyond what we currently have. As we only have a 5 and a 6 link setup, not a 6 link setup, and we don't have any awakened gems, currently between Flamewall damage and Righteous Fire, I'm getting about 2.5 million DPS on this setup. I would imagine you can get that much closer to 4 or 5 million damage with a decent amount of extra optimization, getting awakened gems and such. And I really think this build has some good upside for what it can do in terms of boss killing as well as map clear. So, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Appreciate you all taking the time to watch, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day, guys. We're smarter, we're more advanced now, we've learned from our past mistakes. I just want to give him a little bit of a head start on us there. Oh, come on! This is bull! Why is that still a thing? There we go. Didn't brick the fight, we're fine. We almost did it deathless, kind of. Like, if you don't count the fact where I ran into a storm twice, almost deathless.